next thing we're going to talk about here is cloud application-centric infrastructure inside of the Microsoft Azure cloud. My name is John Gardner. For anybody who's just joining us, thank you very much again. So right now, I'm getting a lot of people asking me, you know, hey, John, we've got this this application-centric infrastructure sat down at our data center, and we kind of want to start taking a look at hybrid solutions. Do we have the ability to have a consistent policy model between your application-centric infrastructure in your data center and the devices in your Azure cloud? And the answer is a resounding yes. Absolutely, we can. So in this tech talk, that's a quick overview. The first thing we're going to do is just talk about the different key points that we're going to talk about. Target audience: anybody who's looking for again a consistent policy model between your application-centric data center and your Azure cloud. So let's go ahead and take a look at the objectives here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you into what Cloud ACI actually is. And then we're going to talk about some challenges here inside the cloud environment, the hybrid cloud environment. There's a lot of challenges. One of the biggest, obviously, you're going to keep hearing is consistent configuration and consistent policy, especially when it comes to security. Excuse me. Now, one of the things that we definitely want to talk about, and this is going to be one of the first slides, excuse me, is actually the multi-site orchestrator. Now, the multi-site orchestrator, what it allows you to do is essentially add multiple application-centric infrastructure sites. With that being said, now your Azure cloud can actually be one of those sites for you, right? So we're talking about adding the ACI data center to the same console, the multi-site orchestrator, to the same console as your Azure cloud. Then I'm going to talk about policy enforcement. This is where I really get into what are the different methods of installation, or what are the different topology types. Now, the ones that I'm going to throw up there today are going to be the common ones that you're going to see a lot, but that by all means does not mean that you have to have it built exactly the same way we're going to show you here today. And then I'm also going to talk about how do we install the Cloud ACI application or plugin for your Azure cloud. We're actually going to go inside the Azure cloud. I don't have a cloud, but I've got some graphics to show you how we go into Azure, your Azure dashboard, Azure console, and bring in this Cloud APIC that's super important for us right now. The last thing is I'm going to talk about the key benefits, and really the key benefit is that it does a lot of stuff for you, right? There's not a lot of configuration. It's a lot of point and click. Make sure you've got IP address and credential information, and we're ready to rock and roll. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in here. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to show you the multi-cloud orchestrator. The multi-cloud orchestrator, when it first came out, what we were really doing was we were just adding a bunch of sites together so that I could create policy here on the multi-site orchestrator and push it down consistently to all of our sites. Now, this is kind of neat here because at this point, let's say that I have a web server over here trying to talk to an application server over here. It's going to have the exact same policy that you're going to see over here on site B. Now, here's one of the biggest challenges right now is getting that cloud site to have the same security policies that we see over on the on-prem sites. And again, one of the things that's going to help us do that is that multi-site orchestrator. This is going to give us consistent policy across all of the clouds. Also, workload migration. So we've been talking about, you know, possibly using this as a failover. Yeah, we could do that. A single point of orchestration. This is kind of neat. We're not just talking about pushing policy. We're talking about building VMs, cloning virtual machines, migrating them, deploying them, tons of different things that normally would take us a long time to do. across all 4 of these sites, I can do in a snap just by selecting the site and saying, go deploy something, right? So the last thing here is the secure automated connectivity. So one thing that we are going to be using here is IPsec tunnels and VXLAN. So if you folks are familiar with those terms, IPsec's going to keep that communication nice and secure. We're going to use VXLAN to allow our layer 2, layer 3 connectivity between the different sites, so we can do routing and switching. Now, what are some of the challenges that we see today to be able to build a consistent architecture like what we just saw in the last slide? The first thing is the automation, right? I need to be able to automate a secure connection between my on-prem, which is my location that I'm at, my data center, my physical data center, and my cloud. One of the neat things, just as a quick heads up, one of the neat things is that the multi-site orchestrator, or I'm sorry, the Cloud APIC, it creates these CSR 1000 Vs that you're going to use for IPsec tunneling. It creates them for you and then configures both sites so they can see each other. You put almost no effort into creating that connection between your on-prem and your cloud devices. I like that. What about diverse and disjoint capabilities across on-prem and private and public cloud? Okay, so what do they mean by that? That means that with, let's say, your public cloud, that's going to operate pretty differently than your on-prem data center or your private cloud, right? Those work pretty differently because, well, one's physical and one's virtual, right? They have different interface or device requirements. So how are we going to deal with this diversity? And again, you're going to notice that we're going to be using the Cloud APIC to deal with that. Another thing that I really do not like is having 6 different management tools up, right? I got the Azure dashboard open, vCenter, UCS Manager, the Cisco APIC. I don't even want to talk about firewalling and load balancing, all that jazz, right? I'm not a huge fan. What if I told you that we could have one single pane of glass that sees all of that for us during the deployment? And we can also get tons of really great information about anything that's running. So CPU and memory utilization on a virtual machine over in the cloud, I can get the same information over there on the data center too. So we can see all of our VMs in one large container and just, oh, that one looks like it's overloaded, right? Throw some more RAM in it. These next 3 are pretty big. Inconsistent security. When we talk about inconsistent security segmentation, John, we've met before. Imagine having to configure, 10 firewalls today by hand. You don't get to copy and paste. You got to configure it by hand. We are accident prone, right? We're going to fat finger something and probably mess something up. Then also with the whole subnets and VLANs, we're looking at different infrastructure components that we apply security to. In ACI, we look at applications. In a standard data center, you're going to look at IP address and VLAN info. Inside the cloud, you're looking at VM container information. So how do we apply consistent security parameters across all these wildly different environments? Now, the learning curve. There's always going to be a learning curve for everything, but what we're starting to see from Cisco is with these new appliances that they come out with, like for instance, the multi-site orchestrator and the Cloud APIC, everything is just a point and click wizard. It's beautiful. And another thing is that once you jump in here, you'll notice that there's a lot of help options. Almost everything that you click on is defined, or you can just hover over it and it'll tell you what it's asking for, right? It'll define it. So you're literally able to learn as you do it instead of sitting there, oh man, there's too many new terms. I'm afraid of this. right? That's how I felt about IPv6, right? All right, and then the inability to leverage consistent L4 through 7 service integration. This is another really, really big thing. When we talk about layer 4 through 7, we're talking about the OSI. The layer 4 through 7 services are things like firewalls, load balancers, SSL offloaders, net scalers for WAN acceleration, right? So all of those L4 through 7 devices, how did we traditionally insert those into our environment? Well, that was usually with some sort of VLAN and routing, right? Static routes. We're going to push all traffic with this default route over to this firewall across this VLAN. No, what we want to see is a simpler method to say, hey, if a web server is trying to talk to the outside or vice versa, send it to this firewall. Call it a day. Now, we're going to do that by utilizing policy. And so you're going to hear me say policy a lot, okay? And I'll get to that here in just a moment. But jumping back into the multi-site orchestrator, as you can see, this is going to resolve a lot of problems that we saw, a lot of the challenges that we saw in the last slide. So for instance, it is a single pane of glass for management for all of your interconnected sites, whether they be hybrid or public-private cloud. It's a centralized location for your policies. See, there's that term again, right? And don't worry, we've got a slide for that. But yes, we're identifying policy in one centralized location. This makes it to where, our East data center, it does not have different security policies than our West data center. We want to make sure that those line up identical. Otherwise, we could run into some issues, especially if we're looking at failover. Now, with the Cisco ACI, Cloud ACI, and the orchestrator, notice they say functions they expand to the cloud site. So ACI, for instance, it works on an application model, not VLANs, not VM attributes, right? It works on an application if I see an application. That right there is building in that disjointed environment to where everybody's looking at an application instead of looking at application over here in ACI, looking at ACLs here in your Nexus environment, looking at VM attributes inside of your cloud. What I want to do is I want to be able to have everybody, let's say, look at application. This is going to create a very consistent environment for us. And that right there is what Cloud ACI is going to do for us. But also the multi-site orchestrator functionality. So the ability to create, a bunch of VMs on the fly or add a new FlexPod or VBlock on the fly, right? So it's extending the functionality of ACI and MSO into our cloud. Very, very important right now. It is responsible for site registration on both on-prem data centers and the cloud site. And guess what? All you have to do is get the cloud APIC in Azure and the MSO. Then all you do is you add 2 new virtual data centers, each with the IP address of your data center and of your cloud. And so with that, it will then automate the creation of the overlay between them. It does it for you, right? I don't want to be sitting here creating EVPNs, VXLAN, multi-protocol BGP. Oh my goodness, IPsec tunnels, holy smokes, right? Why would I want to ever type, crypto, right? Like crypto ISA, whatever that was back in the day to do VPNs. I don't have to do that. Add the sites. It creates the connectivity for you. We like that. Now, with that being said, not only are we publishing policies here to your on-prem data center, but we can push that same policy over to the Microsoft Azure cloud. Now, when I talk policy, actually, this is what we're talking about, and I'll get to that in just one second. So when we look at using the cloud APIC inside of Microsoft Azure, that's what really makes this all work, folks. you're going to install the Cloud APIC add-on or plugin inside of your Microsoft Azure dashboard. And this is what's going to act like it's an APIC or an application policy infrastructure controller at your cloud environment, at your cloud, in your Microsoft Azure cloud. So now the functionality that we used to just have here on the ACI on-prem site, we now have the same functionality over here on your Azure environment. So what this application policy infrastructure controller is doing for us is it's, well, for one, it's creating a REST, northbound REST interface. And what that means is there's, with programmability, we have what's called a representative state transfer. It's used for automation, for pushing scripts to a device, right? We used a REST API to do that. We're going to be doing the same thing now. This Cisco Cloud APIC has a REST API that I can push stuff to using something like the multi-site orchestrator. Also here, it is going to accept the ACI policy model, right? So essentially this is acting exactly like an APIC. So when I push configuration down here to my ACI site, it's actually pushing the exact same thing with the exact same understanding over here to the Cloud APIC. This is also going to do endpoint discovery. So your Cloud APIC, it does have visibility into the virtual machines living inside of your Azure cloud. We also are going to do policy translation. Now this is super important. Let's draw something up here really quick. Inside of ACI, let's say that we've got 2 workstations here, and I'm just going to draw one switch. Sure. Over here, I have 2 virtual machines. The way that you associate a server to the application-centric infrastructure is you assign what's called an endpoint group or an EPG. This might be web and this might be app. What this allows me to do is it allows the application-centric infrastructure to control access from the web server to the app server by using contracts, basically ACLs. Over here, though, we don't have that understanding of what an endpoint group is. What we're doing is we're using virtual networks. Now, when it talks about converting the ACI constructs to your Azure construct, what they're doing is they're basically stating that this network construct, the network group that you apply to the virtual machines, has essentially the same information and function as they do here inside of ACI. So the APIC over here, usually signified by a diamond, and that is a horrible diamond, we're essentially pushing the same constructs, whether it's an ACI fabric or it's an Azure cloud. So again, we can control access between the devices based upon those endpoint groups. That is what they mean by performs cloud policy translation, right? It will translate what we understand here into something that Microsoft Azure understands. Another thing that's really, really neat is that it configures the cloud routers to control plane. So it actually creates that IPsec VPN tunnel and the VXLAN encapsulation and enables it on your CSR 1000 Vs, which is really cool. We're going to see that here in just a second. And it'll configure the data path between these guys across the IP network. Again, that's because we're using this multi-site orchestrator to give them knowledge of each other so that they can build connections between each other. Now, like I said, the policies that we're instantiating here, very simple. You are going to go ahead and assign endpoint groups to different servers. So if that server is a web server, he's going to be part of Web EPG. Then inside ACI or in the multi-site orchestrator, we're going to create contracts between them. You know, this contract is a very simple ACL. That's pretty much all it is. And you can create advanced ACLs, but it is controlling access between a web server and an app server. For us to do that inside the cloud without the APIC, you're going to have to use some sort of firewall. Here, all I have to do is create this policy, and let's go back here really quick. All I have to do is create that policy, and anytime the ACI fabric sees a web server trying to talk to an app server, it will look at the contract and verify if they are allowed to talk. That's the policy. Now that we have an APIC over here, we can do the same thing. When I see a web server trying to talk to an app server, I can tell the network, yeah, sure, go ahead and allow that. And the best part about all of this is it's the same policy. So you have your endpoint groups here and your contracts between them. This one singular policy is used on both sides. This is very important these days because nowadays we're using a lot of policy reuse. We want to make sure that, you know, obviously if I create a policy once, I don't have to keep creating over and over and over. So inside the multi-site director, I can create that one singular policy and push it down to the APIC on-prem in ACI and the APIC inside of Azure. And then it should, if everything's configured correctly, since this is IT, it should permit that traffic for you. Now, inside, oh, and actually, by the way, this is what the policy looks like inside of ACI, inside of your APIC. This is what it looks like inside of your Azure cloud. And notice, let's say from the internet to a web server, I'm permitting port 80 and 443. Let me go back here really quick. Look at this. This could be, we'll just call this outside in this web. I've got a contract that says this is the source, this is the destination, permit 80 and 443. All we're doing is translating this thing called a contract into something that Azure understands. That's all it's doing. All right, now, when you install the APIC here in the Azure cloud, we have our cloud APIC. What it does, all of this stuff, by the way, is automated. It does all of this for you, by the way. I like it. The application policy infrastructure controller here inside the Azure cloud will create dual CSR 1000 Vs. Okay, these are cloud service routers. They are virtual, obviously, because we're inside the Azure cloud, but it will create IPsec tunnels between what we call our virtual network groups. These are very similar to the EPGs that we were just talking about. This could be web and this could be app. Ooh, let me go back here. This could be web and this could be app. Also, when you see this VNet, this would be your subnets. So as you can see here, this is doing a dual function. This is providing the layer 3 outbound connections. It's creating with the IPsec tunnels, but it's also being able to route between the two subnets. And keep in mind that contract is going to be living right here, permitting this traffic from one subnet to another or from one endpoint group to another endpoint group. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a couple of different ways that we can model our policy enforcement and model our environment. This one's very similar to what you were just seeing, but instead of having one infrastructure network. We're actually going to create 2 here just to keep things like broadcast and ARP separate, right, inside the virtualized environment. And note that, yeah, you're just going to have one APIC here. You're going to have that one cloud APIC. So this is very similar to what we just saw on the last slide, but I want to mention here that note that these CSR 1000Vs, these guys are connected. The CSR 1000V is connected outbound, hopefully to the L3 out of at the Cisco ACI on-prem site. Now, here's what it looks like when they're communicating with CSR 1000V from the cloud, from the Azure cloud to your on-site. We're going to be using BGP EVPN sessions. Okay, so this right here, the control plane, a great example of this is what happens when I add a new virtual machine over here. Well, if these guys don't know about it, they're just going to drop the packet. So one of the things that we send back and forth is node reachability information, identifying that a new node has been added to our environment. Awesome. So that's all done with BGP EVPN session information. The IPsec tunnel, that's going to create your underlay, right? So that's acting like your physical cable. But what's running over it is the actual data. And the data between these guys. So if this is a web, let's say a web server over here, talking to an application or a database server over here, all that data is going to be encapsulated in a VXLAN tunnel. So we have secure communication from our cloud to our on-prem site. Now, a couple of different ways to do this again. And what we're looking at from this point is from the perspective of ACI. You can see we've got our on-prem APIC and then our cloud APIC. One thing to note here is a very simple thing here. We have these things called bridge domains or subnets. If you are familiar with a SVI, a switched virtual interface, hey, that's pretty much exactly what this is. So let me draw this out here really quick. So let's draw this out here really quick. From the perspective of ACI, you have your endpoints. That's what the EPGs are. It's just instead of it being in a single endpoint, it's a group of endpoints that are running the same application. Pretty simple to understand. But what do we normally plug endpoints into? Probably some sort of layer 2 switch, right? And then we use an SVI, a switched virtual interface, to talk up to a layer 3 router. So that, let's say that you plug in another switch, right? And you want to be able to talk to another application, we'll call this a database application. They're probably in 2 separate subnets. You need this router to be able to route from one endpoint group subnet to another. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this over a little bit here. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We have our layer 1 or application constructs here. Well, maybe not layer 1, our end host constructs. Then you attach those to something very similar to a VLAN. We call it a bridge domain. Then if you want them to be able to talk to other bridge domains, you're going to have a layer 3 construct or good old routing, right? Absolutely. That's exactly what we're building here, folks, just from a virtualized perspective with policy, right? So I'm just building this in policy so that I don't have to connect to each box and build SVIs, routing tables, routing protocols, trunks. Oh my goodness, so much more. Okay. Now, another thing to mention here is the contract. That contract, hey, folks, whenever you allow one subnet to talk to another, don't you usually configure an ACL to permit or deny that? Yeah, that's what a contract is. It lives between two end nodes and either permits or denies traffic. In this case with ACI, we're in what we call a whitelisting scenario, where you can't talk unless you've allowed that traffic. And so that's why you're seeing over here, we said, yeah, that web server's got to talk to that app server. And if this guy ever goes down, I need to be able to contact the backup app server or web server. So we've just simply created contracts between them. Now we can kind of clean this up a little bit by using what's called shared EPG, or I'm sorry, stretched EPGs. What it does is you're essentially using the same endpoint group here inside of ACI and on your on-prem as you are inside your cloud. What this reduces is the complexity of your access control lists. So instead of you thinking about creating, think about it this way. In this example, I'm creating an ACL for every connection that this app server would be using from one host to another. Over here, you're creating a ACL from subnet to subnet. Does that make sense? So this is just another way that we can build that, that virtualized networking here. Here's another way. Heaven forbid you ever need to get out to the interwebs in case you want to, use the internet. Inside of ACI, if we go over here, let's select, move this guy over here. If you wanted to get out to the internet, normally what you're going to do is you're going to send that to a default gateway, right? You're going to definitely set that to a default gateway, right? This is what we call in ACI an L3 out. This is what allows these workstations to get out to the internet. Inside of your Azure cloud, we can create a cloud L3 out that acts pretty much exactly the same. And you know what's really nice is this L3 out is built the same way on both sides. They might be different policies, but they're built the same way. And we're building it from the multi-site orchestrator. So I don't have to connect to one interface, right? And then build out that L3 out and hope it works, and then go over here to a different interface and build that L3 out. It's all within the same interface. Now, if you guys remember back in the day, back in my day when dinosaurs roamed the earth, those are my T-Rex hands, by the way, ancient times, we used to have these things called branch offices and headquarter scenarios, right? Where you would have something like this, where you would have a headquarters and then a couple of branch offices over here. But what we used to do in the early days is we might have some firewalls over here. So we're just going to call that firewall, right? What was going on there was at that time, we didn't have a lot of bandwidth. We didn't have a lot of, money to buy a firewall for every single office. So what we would do is we would create that centralized scenario where this would be my WAN between my offices, and this would be my service provider. You were allowing all the branch offices to go through the WAN to your firewalls and then be filtered out to the internet service provider. That right there is the scenario that we're talking about here, right? Where you're going to have the cloud use maybe a physical firewall to get out to the internet. You could do that. In the previous example, let me go back one more. There we go. I know how to use slides. If I go back one more, what this is truly creating, let me show you here. So this was an older methodology. The other one, that previous example here, was imagine creating like a multi-home solution, right? Where the Azure cloud could use its own interwebs and your ACI fabric could have its own internet. So now you can have a side A and a side B. Hey, we can even look at failover at this point because we do support multi-site, multi-pod. So this is just another way to build out the infrastructure. All right, now, the last thing I want to mention here is let's get that Cloud APIC inside of Azure. So you're going to go ahead and log in your Azure account. You're going to go home and then marketplace, sorry. And under marketplace, you can click on get started and then pop in. Now here, I might say like server 2008, just because, you know, I feel like being back in 2008, right? I could type in ASA Firewall, right? These are the catalogs of plugins and extensions that we can use or virtual machines that we can install inside of our Azure cloud. Here, I'm going to say Cloud APIC. And that should bring up your Cisco Cloud APIC. So what this is going to do is bring an ACI, application policy infrastructure, virtual machine into your Azure mix. The next thing you're going to want to do here, and you need to walk through each one of these. So you have to build your basic configuration, and that's down here. You can see like your SSH keys, your subscription information, what region you're in, and this is all the Azure stuff, right? But note it's creating a virtual machine named Cisco APIC. Then down here under the ACI settings, that's how you're going to talk to your ACI APIC. Yeah. So you build that here in basic and then ACI settings, and then under review and create, hey, that's your summary page. That's telling you what you built. We're going to go ahead and click create. Now, notice I'm still inside the Azure dashboard. When you go to that virtual machine that you just created, right? And yeah, you can't really read it. Sorry about the graphic, but sure, that says Cloud APIC. Yeah, it says Cloud APIC, I promise. And what you'll notice is the IP address of the device. What you'll need to do is go to that IP address through a web browser, and you should see a Cloud APIC dashboard. When you first pop in, it's going to ask you, hey, welcome. Would you like to start the basic setup? And this is where you can see essentially the same view from the Cloud APIC that you would see in an ACI fabric. But what's really neat is once you get this all hooked in, you can create a policy here or on your prem, and guess what? They synchronize back and forth. So at that point, it configures everything for you. You see the policies exactly the same on both sides. Okay. Now, the last thing here is the key benefits. And I put this slide in because I wanted to reiterate what that whole Cloud APIC was doing for us and the whole Cloud ACI was doing for us. So here, obviously, this is going to automate some stuff. In this example, they're talking about the end-to-end configuration. If you remember the IPsec VPN tunnel, right? So it's gonna drop in a pair of CSR 1000Vs, those cloud service routers, into your Azure cloud, and it's gonna build and programs them to form an IPsec tunnel that is installed, terminating at the on-prem site. Once that's done, the multi-site configurator, or multi-site orchestrator, sorry, will automatically build the BGP EVPN for you. Right, you remember seeing all that VXLAN, EVPN, IPsec? All of that is done as soon as you drop in that cloud service router. That is one of the key benefits that I feel, especially when we talk about learning curves and building all of this connectivity out. To do that, from a hand, a hand typed perspective, that just reminds me a lot of like DM VPNs, right? The dynamic multi-point VPNs. It was a great solution, but man, there was just a lot of configuration, right? Here, it does it for you. It's a beautiful thing. And it will actually build those IPsec VPN tunnels and BGP EVPN tunnels and their VXLAN tunnels between any site that you have. Okay, so with that being said, folks, thank you very much for joining me today here at Sunset Learning for our Tech Talks. If you guys would like to take a look at some other service offerings that we have, you're more than welcome to go to www.sunsetlearning.com or you can shoot us a call.